Constructed of limestone, granite, cement, and suspension cables, the Brooklyn Bridge stretches approximately 6,000 feet, connecting Brooklyn to Manhattan, New York. In a single day, it is traversed by roughly 144,000 vehicles, but it is the unique structure that makes it one of the most iconic in the nation. In 1869, when construction began, the bridge was the first of its kind and was set to be the longest suspension bridge in the world. The construction was anything but easy, however, and after a series of accidents and injuries left the designer and chief engineer incapable of carrying the project forward, it would be up to an unexpected individual to step in and save the bridge. That person was Emily Warren Roebling. Before we begin, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. Emily Warren was born in Cold Spring, New York on September 23, 1843. She was the second youngest of 12 children. Raised in an upper-middle-class household that could trace its heritage back to the Mayflower, Emily received an excellent education at Georgetown Academy of the Visitation in Washington, D.C. While there, she studied subjects like art, needlework, and housekeeping, as was expected of all women of status. But Emily possessed a curious mind and was not satisfied studying only subjects deemed appropriate for women. She expanded her studies beyond expectation and enjoyed additional topics such as mathematics, astronomy, French, and history. In 1864, near the end of the American Civil War, Emily visited her brother Governor K. Warren, a Union commander. During the visit, she attended an officers' ball where she met the man who would become her husband, Washington Roebling. Washington, a colonel at the time, was serving as an engineering officer under her brother, and he and Emily hit it off quickly. Her beauty and intellect enamored him, and the two quickly fell in love. In a letter to his sister, Washington wrote about Emily, stating, "Some people's beauty lies not in the features, but in the varied expression that the countenance will assume under the various emotions. She is a most entertaining talker, which is a mighty good thing, you know, I myself being so stupid." It was clear that Washington held his wife in high regard. By marrying into the Roebling family, Emily would find herself surrounded by some of the most brilliant engineers of the era. Despite his own words, Washington was anything but stupid. Besides being an engineer himself, he was the son of the esteemed John Roebling. John was a German-American engineer who had made a name for himself by building suspension bridges throughout the country. He had a brilliant mind, and his creation and use of suspension cables made him a highly sought-after designer and engineer. In the 1860s, he designed what would become known as the Brooklyn Bridge, which was to be the connecting point between Brooklyn and Manhattan. At the time, the design made it the longest suspension bridge in the world, but with something so extraordinary came some complications. John had built his share of suspension bridges, with Washington often assisting, but none were as long as the plan for the Brooklyn Bridge. Additionally, the East River has a maximum depth of 108 feet. Setting the two foundations presented a unique challenge. For this issue, John turned to his son and his new wife. Upon their marriage in 1865, Emily and Washington left for Europe, where they spent their honeymoon touring the continent. Their primary objective when there, however, was studying caissons, watertight structures filled with compressed air. The caissons would be instrumental in allowing workers to venture into and under the East River and plant the bridge's foundations. They returned to the United States in 1868 with a plethora of vital information on caissons. Upon their return, Washington traveled to Ohio to help his father complete his work on a suspension bridge there. He was surprised and delighted when Emily followed, wanting to be a part of her husband's life and work, rather than stay in New York and take care of the home. Where Washington was his father's confidant and right hand, Emily became her husband's. When the project was completed, they all moved back to New York in 1869, where they would all play a role in constructing the Brooklyn Bridge, John's masterpiece. Unfortunately, John did not get to see his dream come to fruition. His passing would be the first catastrophe the family would experience during the bridge's construction. In a freak accident, John had been visiting the dockyards when a barge coming into port hit a piling he was standing next to, knocking it into his foot and crushing it. Sadly, John died of tetanus only a month after being awarded the project he had worked so hard to design. After his death, the project fell to his son, Washington, who knew the plans for the bridge like they were his own, though he admitted to being overwhelmed. "At first, I thought I would succumb," he wrote, "but I had a strong tower to lean upon, my wife, a woman of infinite tact and wisest counsel." So, Washington took over as chief engineer, overseeing the early years of construction. During that time, Emily managed the household and focused on raising their young son, John A. Roebling II. Poor Washington had no idea at the time just how much he would come to rely on his wife, both during the project and for the rest of his life. In 1872, after only 4 years on the job, Washington experienced a debilitating sickness. Due to his frequent entering and exiting of the caissons, which plunged deep under the river, Washington came down with decompression sickness, also known as the bends. During the project, over 100 workers developed decompression illness, which proved crippling, if not lethal, for all who experienced it. The affliction reportedly left Washington partially blind, paralyzed, and deaf. He battled the side effects of the illness for the rest of his life. Luckily for him, his wife Emily had spent so much time by his side. From the beginning, he had entrusted her with everything he knew about the project, so she was up to speed on the status and plans, just as he was. She took it upon herself to learn everything she could about bridge construction and lobbied tirelessly for her husband to retain his position as chief engineer, despite his illness. She acted as a go-between for him and the crew, sharing updates about progress and delivering orders to the workers. It was only a short time before she became the surrogate chief engineer on the project. Emily worked hard to study engineering and the science behind bridge building, stress analysis, material strength, cable construction, and calculations for catenary curves. She supervised the staff and construction crew, oversaw inspections, ordered supplies, spoke to reporters, dealt with politicians, and handled all the day-to-day business for the last 10 years of the bridge's construction. All this while caring for her young son and bedridden husband, to whom she remained devoted. Emily Warren Roebling became the public face behind the 14-year construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. When it opened on May 24, 1883, Emily Warren Roebling was the first person to cross Brooklyn Bridge via carriage. She sat next to President Chester A. Arthur and held a rooster as a symbol of victory as the carriage made the maiden voyage across the bridge that she had spent years overseeing the construction of. Congressman Abram S. Hewitt, a political reformer and steelmaker, said in his speech that the name of Emily Warren Roebling would be ever coupled with the Brooklyn Bridge, and that it was an everlasting monument to the sacrificing devotion of a woman and of her capacity for that higher education from which she has been too long disbarred. After the completion, Emily became an advocate for women's rights, writing an essay entitled "A Wife's Disabilities." She spoke out in favor of women's rights and against discriminatory laws against women. In addition, she joined the Daughters of the American Revolution and earned her law certificate from New York University. While she is often overlooked today, her contributions to the project largely ignored, Emily never doubted her capabilities. "I have more brains, common sense, and know-how generally than have any two engineers, civil or uncivil," she wrote. "And but for me, the Brooklyn Bridge would never have had the name Roebling in any way connected with it." She remained actively involved in women's rights and kept mentally sharp until her passing. Like the Brooklyn Bridge, she stands as a symbol for strength, perseverance, intelligence, and grace. Although recognized for her indispensable efforts during the construction, her name became buried in history over time. It's time the world remembers her name again and celebrates her accomplishments. Emily passed away on February 28, 1903 from stomach cancer. In 2018, the New York Times published the obituary of Emily Warren Roebling as part of their Overlooked series, a succession of obituaries dedicated to women and others who at the time of their death were largely ignored due to being the wrong gender or race. In the obituary, they highlighted all that Emily had accomplished, bringing to light again a woman who had been long forgotten and passed over. Today, a plaque on the bridge is dedicated to the memory of Emily Warren Roebling, her husband, and her father-in-law. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.